Okay, so Julian, at this point, we've made an effect. It's pretty basic, but we have our embers and we have our sort of flashy particle. We've run through some really basic steps of how to work in Niagara with all of our properties and do some basic particle simulations. We've made a really basic material and we've connected it into Blueprint. But our effect is still quite simple and it's missing something, right? Ordinarily, if I were working on an explosion, the very first thing that I would start with is the smoke. That's the bulk of the effect that you're going to be looking at. We skipped it and we kind of took this different path because I wanted to gradually step up, but let's actually dive in.
Yeah, let's do it.
Smoke and fire, they tend to be really complex motion that you can't achieve through just your particle simulation. And so in the last episode, I was mentioning that the material itself plays so much power in our career paths as visual effects artists. And that's because there's so many ways to actually put motion in here that's playing on the particles themselves. We can do crazy mathematical procedural motion. We can play back movies. We can do super weird distortions and scroll things along meshes. There's just a lot of different tricks, etc. The one that we're going to do today is what we refer to as a flipbook, but it is effectively just playing a movie back. We've got a link to a downloads page where we're trying to just give you guys 3 assets. One of them is that core flash texture that I use, which you guys could also have painted. Another one is a geometry for a rock. We'll get to that in a future episode. But the one that I want to pay attention to right now is this fireball texture. If we load it up, this fireball texture is actually just a movie sequence. It is 64 frames of a fireball going from like the expansive blast into slowly dissipating smoke. This is rendered out of a simulation tool. There's a ton of simulation tools that are really, really good. And so this is where, depending on the artist you talk to, they're going to use different tools. This one is actually just based off of a template in a tool called EmberGen, which we'll dive into momentarily. But for now, what I want to show you is actually how we use these types of quote unquote flipbooks to play back this movie sequence on a particle and the power of what that can do. So if we take this and we once again go back to Unreal and we import it, and I'm going to import it into our effects directory by simply dragging it in. You can see once again it's a texture loaded. I've got T underscore. I like to include the frame numbers, so it's an 8x8 texture, 64 frames total, so that's what we've named it. And once again, you can see that it's loaded up. This one does have an alpha channel attached to it because of the way that I rendered it. So that's a key difference between our old texture and this one. Let's go ahead and make a new material. We could duplicate this in the content browser to start from it simply by right-clicking and going duplicate, or we could just start from scratch. It's quite simple. I think I'm going to start from scratch just to reiterate for you. For sure. So I'll have you walk me through what we do. So M_fireball. Load this up, we get a new material. We need to first set this up for use on particles, right? It's showing all of the properties as if it was going to be used on our environment. So do you remember what we need to change? There's 2 properties.
I think that we needed to change the material. No, not the physical material, the blend mode.
Yeah. Blend mode, there you go. What do we change it to?
I believe we need translucent.
Yeah, that's right. Translucent, think transparent. We want our particles to be able to fade out, so we need transparency. We need that opacity plug. The other one is our lighting. So I'm going to change default lit to what? Loads of options.
I'm going to get it unlit.
Yeah. So now we have the plugs that we need. And I'm going to go and just start us off default. We want to be able to pass data from Niagara back into our materials. So I'm going to take our particle color. We will plug that into emissive and opacity. Here we have perfectly acceptable particle shader if we're fine just showing solid colors on our sprites. Let me get our texture in, however, because what we want is to be able to use this guy. And here, like I said, we have an opacity channel and our color channel. So last time we did what to blend between these two?
We used the multiply.
That's right.
Node.
So I'm going to multiply our alpha from the texture against our opacity from Niagara. And I'm going to multiply our colors against the color from Niagara and plug those both in. All right.
And when you drag the texture sample in, is it okay? So it's not yet set to sort of play as a movie.
No, not at all.
Okay, got it.
Nope, this is still just a texture.
Okay.
The cool thing that we're about to do is, and we could do this through math, but Niagara has these great shortcuts that are called sub-UVs, basically. We won't dive into more why that naming is what it is, but we're basically going to say that this is an 8x8 texture, and so it's going to scale down to 1/64th, just that like corner image. And then we're going to tell it to hop between those images to play this back as if it were a movie. And so if we go back to, we hit save, if we go back to Niagara and start setting this up, whenever I start working with materials, one of the most useful things that I do is I just make a static particle. I don't have it move. I just see what a particle is that I can focus on the material. So I'm going to go ahead and replicate that right now while we start this. I'll start with another empty emitter. We're going to name this one what?
This is our explosion.
Yeah.
Or maybe the fire of our explosion?
It's going to be fire and smoke. I named the material Fireball, so let's call this Fireball as well. Keep throwing you under the bus on these questions, Julian. I'm sorry.
That's what I'm here for.
I'm going to go ahead and assign our material to this as well. It's kind of just jumping ahead. We're speeding up a little bit, right? So I'm going to go down to the sprite render, drag and drop our material. And then we don't currently have any particles, so I'm going to add a spawn burst. One particle is fine for me right now. And what you can see when we do that, actually, I'm going to turn off every other emitter. I think we've already explained this, but I could just go through and check these off. There's also this handy little dude right here, which is isolate this one emitter. So you can see that I have a single particle, but it's just showing all of my explosion, right? I can make it a little bit bigger if we want. So if I grab the size, let's just make it huge. There we go. Giant explosion texture. Now what I want to do is tell this sprite render, hey, you've got sub-UVs. And so if you actually click on the sprite render module again, there is a sub-UV section, and it has sub-image size, and that 8x8 comes in handy here, the naming convention. Now what it's done is it's just picked the first frame, which is the top left corner of that texture. I guess I have Photoshop open, so we're just seeing sort of that, right? And now what we need to do is tell Niagara to jump between these frames. So to do that is simply another module. Under the particle update, I type sub-UV and see what we get. The very first one is sub-UV animation. And by default, it's going to intelligently, because I said 8x8, know that it's 64 frames. Frame 0 is the first frame, so we have to offset a little bit. And so it's animating linearly from 0 to 63. If I exit game view and drag this up a little bit, we can actually see our explosion play, right? We got the stuff here to make a cool looking effect. So this is pretty helpful. Do you want to pause here in Niagara and go and look at EmberGen? I think there's a part of me that wants to just move forward, like staying in Niagara, but what I hate to do is just hand you this magical texture that solves all of our problems. I feel like it's really nice to be able to show you a little bit behind the curtain of how this was made, because this really is where all of the magic of this effect is going to come from.
Yeah, let's jump into it.
Right? Okay, all right. I'm going to hit save just so I don't crash and lose anything. Save my material as well. Okay, let's load up EmberGen. While this is loading, EmberGen is a very, very fast, it already loaded, fluid simulation tool to be able to do things like fire and smoke and fog and mist and things like that. There is a free 14-day trial for you guys to just download and play with. This is a really fun tool to play with, and you're going to get really, really nice quality things. So when you first load in, you're going to probably see this. If you click the home button, actually, you know what? I'll teach you in here. You have a viewport with its own navigation controls that you can fiddle with and mess with. You can pause your simulation, restart it. You can also press space to pause and then R for restart. And you'll see that this dynamically simulates very, very, very quickly. A lot of other simulation tools, they take a really long time. And so EmberGen's entire purpose is like, hey, we can iterate quickly, which, as you know, is very true to my heart. So over on the right-hand side, you can middle mouse to pan around this node graph. And as with all these things, there's complexities to this, but it reads more or less right to left, and it starts with an emitter coming off of a shape, and then it simulates. And then they have volume processing and rendering and all kinds of other things. So we won't dive too hard into that, but I super encourage you to just hop in and play with everything you see to see what it does, because as always, it's really fun.
My preferred learning method.
Yeah, let me just crank up noise, for example, and hit restart. We might not be able to see much of that one because it's the scale. We can make it much more turbulent. We can bring down the frequency. And you can see that as I'm changing things, it's updating, which is super, super, super fun. Okay, for the sake of our grenade explosion, I just started with one of their templates because I wanted you guys to be able to hop in and play. And so if you go back to this little home button, go to their presets, you can see that there are all these really cool starting points that the team over at JangaFX has already created. And I just started with the game explosion one. So I'm not going to save my stuff, load this up. There we go. Here is our explosion that we saw in our flipbook. You can watch it again. If we wanted to, we could go ahead and change things. I'm just going to keep moving forward. The key thing here that I want to show you is how to really just directly connect this into Unreal so that you can start to make changes in EmberGen and then see your changes on your effect in Unreal, because that's, again, closing the loop of working. So we have this render node at the very, very end. And if you scroll down, you can see that there's an Export Now button that's slightly grayed out because we need to choose a directory. I'm just going to go ahead and drop this into that same assets folder next to our other stuff. Place this wherever you want. We'll let it, I'm going to leave it named whatever it is. The only other thing that I want to point out here, because I'm going to change this in a minute, is there's a section for the first frame, the number of frames, and then what they call the frame stride. If you look at our simulation as we watch it, the effect kind of fades away by frame 120, but it's a little bit slower. And so if we just captured the first 64 frames, we would miss part of it. So the frame stride is saying, hey, only bake out every second frame. We could do every third, or so if I just set this to 3, then it's going to be every third frame. If I set it down to 1, then it's just going to be 64 frames. So this is just an easy way to make sure that your flipbook at the end has the full range of frames that you want. I'm going to go ahead and hit Export Now, and it's going to go ahead and simulate. And then it's actually going to give me this cool little preview over here that we can watch to see our flipbook. You can see it picking the frame as we go. If I go look in Windows Explorer, we can see that I've rendered out an image. The one comment that I wanted to have off of this template is that I don't really like that there's really nothing showing on the bottom frames. This is kind of just wasted resolution. And you can see that the fireball's already started up here. That might be useful, but I would rather offset this a little bit. So what I'm going to do is come back over here and change this start frame to just frame 10. If I go back to my scene view and hit simulate really quick, you'll see that by frame 20, I've already got a big fireball. And so just by offsetting it, I'm hopefully going to catch so the smoke fades out right around here. So I think that'll be a little bit more of an appropriate render. And then I just hit Export Now again. It's going to warn me that it's going to overwrite that file. And we render it. It's updated. It's updated on disk. The cool thing here is that it's not that much harder for you to also update this in Unreal. So I'm going to import this new texture that I've grabbed, or that I've created.
Can I guess what you're about to do?
Sure. Please, always.
My guess, based on what I know from my video editing days, is that if you can render it as the same file and replace that file, that Unreal will be able to dynamically pick up on that new file.
Exactly.
And pick up our changes.
Yeah.
Okay.
And then as a worst case, you can actually just right-click, like, I think I can even reroute it, but you can re-import with a new file, or just hit re-import.
That's something I did notice here too, which maybe you'll get into, but I noticed that the playback here in our viewport in Unreal, it seems to be playing back a little bit slower than how it looked in EmberGen.
Correct.
Does it have something to do with the frame rate set somewhere in Unreal, or we've told it go through the frames at a certain speed and we need to adjust that parameter?
Yeah, so remember, we're looking at a Niagara simulation right now, right? We told Niagara to play back our frames. And so if we go back over here to where we made that specific statement where we said linearly play from 0 to frame 63, this is based off of the particle's lifespan.
I see. So if we adjust the lifespan in our Niagara system,
so if I come back over here and make this 2 seconds,
I see.
Then it's playing back faster.
And so would a lifetime of 1 be the equivalent of what the effect wants to play back at in EmberGen?
Natively? You're getting into math offsets and things like that. We have 64 frames.
Got it.
That we've baked out into this texture. EmberGen was probably simulating at 30 frames a second, and so that's going to be roughly 2 seconds, right?
Got it.
A smidge more than 2 seconds.
But I guess at a high level, we can control the playback speed with our particle lifetime.
Yeah,
okay, that makes sense.
Now, I also could. This particular flipbook has an extinction, right? It's ending, but I could come back over here and I could make this loop. And so now, I could have this loop 5 times over the course of that one particle's lifespan.
Sure.
Or what we're actually going to do is I can control this with a curve and get rid of the loop. And so this is, once again, that linear curve, but I can do things like add a keyframe and move this up, and add a keyframe and move this down. Then we can do some time.
Oh, cool.
Yeah, right. That might not be the most useful thing to do per se, but you got artistic choices. You jumped ahead, you got it. So now that I have that texture imported, if I were in my material using that texture, so let me go ahead and update it to this new texture that we're importing. It's going to be the same because it's the same render. But now if I go back and I make any notable changes to things in EmberGen, like if I change my base from a sphere to a box, actually don't know how this is going to look, so let's check it. Okay, so we got a totally different shape out of this simulation.
Yeah, more crescent shaped.
Yeah, totally.
And yeah.
So now I can just go back over here and I can hit export because I really like this new shape. And because it overrode that old file, I can go back to stop it from simulating stuff. I can go back over here to Unreal and simply hit re-import, and it's updated with our new shape. And then once I hit apply over here, the effect would have automatically updated based off a new Flipbook. So just kind of closing that iteration so you guys can start to experiment.
We want to remove our curve, the interesting curve that we have for the sake of being able to visualize our...
I don't know that I've explained this yet, but when you change a property over here in Niagara, anything that you've changed away from the default gets this little like revert arrow, which is very handy because when you break stuff, you can just go, get me back to a safe place. And you just press that, and now you're back to the default. So here I can just go back to linear, and now we're watching our Flipbook again. Make sense?
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Highly encourage you guys to play an EmberGen, or really any other tool that allows you to render out an image sequence. I would be morally remiss to not pause for a quick second and give some general statements about Flipbooks. They're one way to get motion. They're a very, very powerful way to get motion on a particle, but they have some serious consequences. We're limited by texture size here. The texture size that I've given you guys is about 2K by 2K, which is roughly the largest that I would normally go on a visual effect. And so that means that every single frame has to fit within that total texture size. So I can either have less frames and more resolution per individual frame, or more frames and make the resolution of each one individually smaller. Depending on how big your effect goes, you can squash and stretch that however you want. Most of the time we're doing 64 frames. As you pointed out, that's only 2 seconds. And so there's a lot of limitations. The other things that we would get into further on down the road is that there's no random to this. Every time this plays, it's going to play back the exact same. That can be a real big concern. And then finally, I rendered this as what we call a beauty pass, the final image pass. That means that I can't relight my Flipbook. So if you wanted to change the shadow direction based off of the sunlight of the game, you can't use this technique.
And it may seem obvious, but just to clarify that, presumably you wouldn't want to go larger than a 2K by 2K Flipbook because of, the bandwidth of the game, like memory.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, exactly.
Memory and concerns.
There are games that are pushing that. There are times where if this effect is that important to the game, we will absolutely put that resolution into the effect. But as a general rule, you're probably not going to go over 2K on most of your particle effects textures.
Makes sense.
Okay, let's push this now and actually make the core of our actual effect in game. I am going to go back to my original render off of the template instead of that box one. So if we go back to the material really quick.
And as a reminder, this is the texture that is downloadable for you guys.
Correct.
The download link is in the description below.
Yeah, absolutely. So hit save. And we're back to the original, just big, fiery fireball. Fiery fireball. Nailed it. There's one more sort of tricky thing that I want to do regarding sub-UVs in these Flipbooks. And this one is, it's a perk of using Unreal. They've just sort of created a shortcut for us that I want us to use. You can see that as I make this longer, we've only got 64 frames. One trick that you think of to continue allowing, sorry, I'm just trying to find lifespan. That's really bad, right? We don't want to see frame stepping. If only we could crossfade between the frames, then it would sort of imply a better frame rate, right? It's just frame blending, motion flow on Sony TVs or Samsung TVs does this. We can do that too on the hardware, and that is this little nub right here called sub-UV blending enabled. If we turn that on, and we have to do one thing in our material, which is replace this texture sample with a particle sub-UV texture sample, which I will find, there it is, so particle sub-UV. It operates the exact same, except that it tells the hardware that it can crossfade between the two texture samples. So just kind of take my word for it. You'll see when we plug this in that all of a sudden we're going to see crossfading between the frames if I hit apply. And so we can start to imply a better frame rate, right? It's a really, really handy trick to get around that frame limitation of our flipbooks. Okay, now I have an effect that I can start working with because I've just got one giant particle here. Let's start to make a simulation with it in Niagara. Okay, where to start? Right now I'm only spawning one. I'll start there. I think I probably want to spawn something like 5 to 8 of these. I'm gonna go ahead and do a random range between 5 and 8. That way we get a little bit of random variation. We definitely don't want these living for 10 seconds. I do want the smoke to live out a bit though. So let's go ahead and say between 3 seconds and maybe 8 seconds. They're all the same orientation. We always want random. In this case, you know, there is lighting on the smoke, so me turning the particles around is going to change the direction of the shadows. I think this is noisy enough that it won't really matter, so I'm going to come down here and just set the rotation to be random. And then I definitely want our particle size to be random as well, so I'm going to do random uniform here. And I think, just that I don't run us awry, I'm going to check out my notes super fast to see what sizes I landed on, because I don't want to spend hours just polishing this effect in front of you. What I chose was 200 to 600, which is right around like the size of roughly one of these boxes. And you can see that just based off of those random rotations and random sizes, we're starting to get something that looks like a really cool fireball already, right? It definitely doesn't have a strong impact. I would say that there's a couple things that I don't like about this. That's the old one, about the flipbook that we're using. If you look at it, these first few frames are really, they're chunky. It just feels very simulated. It doesn't feel organic. So we're going to try to fast forward past those really quickly. We can also speed up the time that it's in that fireball mode to try to make this feel a little bit more explosive and poppy. So
Presumably something we could do, maybe using curves to try to give it
exactly.
or I guess a little less linearity.
Yeah, we could go back to the simulation and try to fix it in the simulation, or we can mess with those curves in
And play with our frames.
Yeah. Again, I prefer the fastest route first just to see if it works. And so right now it's just playing linearly. Go back to curve. And then I can right click on that keyframe, break the tangent. Let's see what happens when I do this. So once again, I think might have been last episode, you asked me and we were talking about animation curves and I told you like, if you see a linear curve, it's probably bad. It's another example of like, as soon as we made it not linear, it feels more poppy. We could push that quite a bit further though, so I'm actually just going to add a keyframe in here. And I'm going to set it really tight, or UI's a little bit too shrunk. Let's say like, I'm going to have it play halfway through the flipbook sequence within the first 0.1 seconds. So really, really tight expansion. Now the problem that I just made is, you can see we're kind of running out of frames at the end. It's still playing out, so what I want to do now is see if I can make the effect feel like it's expanding through the simulation, as opposed to through the flipbook playing on the particles. I will also, per my statement, try to make this not linear. Play with these handles really quick. Okay, what do you think?
Yeah, it's looking, I mean, it's
Already starting to feel...
Yeah.
Let's make a particle simulation out of this now. So currently we are just spawning these particles and they're staying perfectly still. Very first thing we should consider doing is adding some velocity, right? So I'm going to, once again, add velocity. I'm going to get that warning saying we're not simulating anything. I fixed, and now it's working just fine. I'm going to do velocity from point again, and I want some variation, so I'm going to do a random range. What do you want to do for the minimum? Kind of making this up. I could look at my notes. 5, okay. Barely anything. Maximum, let's go huge.
200.
1200.
1200 is what I said.
There we go. 1200 is what he said. 1200 might be too much. We'll see.
200 is what I said.
we're going to keep this because I also want to add a drag.
Sure.
Right? I want that concept of like rapid expansion that slows down quickly for that pop. And so it's really hard to judge this thus far. So we'll go and add a drag. And I'm going to set it high again. I don't know, man. 1200 and looking pretty good.
That's because that's what I said.
Yeah, that's it.
Yeah.
Once again, I like to key down my my drag amounts, and so I'm going to make this a quick curve. We can just make this fall off a little bit. I don't necessarily want it to go to 0, so I'm going to grab this last keyframe and set it to like 0.3, and then set the scale of this back up to 5, maybe 8. It's feeling pretty explosive right now, right?
Mm-hmm.
Good pick in 1200, man. We're also not scaling up these particles, which, you know, if you think about smoke, it usually starts small and it is expanding as it dissipates and diffuses through the air. And so we're going to add a, what, Julian?
A, what, Keith? I'm checking on you to make sure.
I don't really know either. We're going to scale the particle's sprite size.
Right.
By
test.
By default, I'm glad. By default, this curve starts at 0, which means our particles are tiny, right? And then they're slowly growing up. We don't have to do that. So I'm going to come over here and grab that first keyframe and set it to 1. So it starts at 1. And then I'm going to grab the last keyframe and set it to 2. So now we have just linear growth this way. If I press F, it reframes the graph. As always, I don't want linear curves, so I'm going to set this to user, and I want some pretty rapid expansion here. So I'm going to bow this out. What do you think?
It's looking really good.
Cool.
I think the thing I'm noticing is that we touched on this in a previous episode, but by playing with the by getting creative, I guess, with how we're spawning particles, we're sort of, I think, subverting a little bit of what might be one of the limitations of a Flipbook.
Yeah.
Just that it does feel actually like we're creating a simulation when really we are just sort of spawning the same simulation, but in different ways and at random.
Absolutely. And we're simulating our really, really coarse particles, but then they're playing an individual Flipbook. Now, the entire reason that I chose this particular simulation out of EmberGen is because this view allows me to use it as a puzzle piece in a pile of other duplicates of it, right? If I had instead gone back to, I don't know, like, sure, this one, this artillery explosion viewed from the side, there's no way I could stick a bunch of random versions of that in my effect and have it all fused together. That's the entire explosion right there. So there is actually like a knack for what types of flipbooks and simulations you're using on your flipbooks.
It's looking pretty good. It does feel pretty big if it's a sort of an explosion that's going to hit an object. And
yeah, why don't
coming
we...
off of a smaller projectile.
Okay, so let's see it in context. We also are still only looking at our fireball, so this is like this bizarre moment of truth where normally I wouldn't wait this long to see all the other stuff along with it. I'm going to turn those off and then press play.
This looks pretty cool.
That actually is fusing relatively well. There's a couple changes that I want to make right off the bat, but really we should see this in context, so I'm going to play the game. I'm going to run over here and hit this blue box.
It's pretty good.
I'm not appalled by that size.
Yeah, it actually looks a lot better in context. I would say the sort of initial scale of our sparks, or embers rather, kind of feels a little bit large relative to the...
Yeah, definitely. So we'll tweak that. We'll turn those down. There's another render thing that I really want to fix here, which is those jagged edges. There's a technique that I'm going to have us use that goes into pretty complex material stuff, but fortunately Unreal makes it very easy with just one node, and it's just called a depth fade. Let's go ahead and take a look at that right now. So if I go to my fireballs material, the effect that I'm trying to get rid of is this hard edge, right? Like we are dealing with just flat pieces of paper shoving into geometry. And so I'm trying to sell you on the illusion that that's smoke and has thickness, but it doesn't. It's just a flat quad. And it really is revealed, obviously, when they're intersecting the geometry. So we want to do everything we can to fade that so it's not catching your eye. There's a technique that we can use, and it's just this depth fade node. And if I plug in my opacity and pass it through, and then create a single value to plug into the fade distance, this is going to be the number of centimeters that we're going to use to create a gradient that fades in that particle where it intersects. So if I set it to 100, roughly 1 meter, when I hit apply, that gradient or that edge is going to become a 1 meter tall vertical gradient. You can kind of see it if you're looking, right? But that's way better. You're not drawing the eye straight to this giant bug. A couple other small things. These particles are all spawning from the center still, because I don't have a spawn sphere. You can see over here that I'm using this shape location from the embers. We can just copy and paste this. So I just Control C, Control V, and now I've got it with the same properties. I probably don't want it to be that wide, but at least now we get a little bit of like spawn variation in each one. Make sense?
Yeah, it's looking really good.
Okay. There's something I'm seeing it, and it's really subtle because this effect is a little bit noisy, and so we might not be able to notice it. But by default and for optimizations, we don't do any comparative sorting in our particles so that each particle knows which one is supposed to draw in front of the other one. It's something that, like, unless you have worked in visual effects, you never really think about this, but it's not saying, hey, you're behind the other particle, I want you to draw behind that other particle by default, because that type of checking where every single particle checks its distance to the camera and compares it with everyone else, it's a little bit of a cost associated with it to process. So if we go down to the sprite render, there is a sort mode. There's a section called sorting. Just need to pause to find it. So many properties in here. There's a section called sorting. In sort mode, we can see it set to none. If you come over here and just set it to view distance or view depth, they're both roughly the same for the sake of this example, then the particle that's closest to the camera is always going to draw in front. It's a really, really minor and subtle thing, but I was noticing that we were seeing the particles in the back drawing in front. And so this is going to create a little bit more of a uniform fireball effect. Okay. You wanted to polish up the embers a tiny bit, make them not gargantuan, right?
Yeah, they see it in context.
Yeah.
That initial sort of growth.
Yeah. Okay.
I think we could, and I believe we have that on a curve, so it feels like we could probably.
We do. Do you want to change a value on the curve or just the entire thing?
I think just maybe a value on the curve, because we have it we have that pop, so maybe just bringing that whole curve down.
We also, are you happy with the size of the smallest ones, but not the biggest ones?
Yeah, I think they look really nice when they get smaller. I think it's just they feel very large and glaring in their sort of initial lifespan.
Yeah, so there's a couple different ways we could tweak this, right? Which is why I'm digging in, because we're giving them a random range initial size. And so if we're happy with the small range but not the big range, then we can just bring down the big range.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, let's try that first.
Okay, so our small range is 3 to 10. Our big range is 10 to 20. I'm going to go with or 5 to 12. Let's do 5 to 15.
Yeah, so that's already feeling,
that already feels a little
much better.
They're also spawning, like frame 1, they're way too far out. And so it feels like they've come from a different place. So I'm going to come back to the source location and set this to like 50 maybe even smaller. Something sort of like that. Cool. There's one other thing that I want to try to fix here, which is, you know how I mentioned that particles within themselves are not sorting accurately? If you look at the draw order of our individual elements, what is drawing on top? What is the one that you see layered above everything else right now?
It looks like our fireball.
Yeah, so by default, Niagara just sorts based off of your creation. That's not necessarily what we want, especially with that core flash. Because
we're not really seeing that flash.
It's behind our smoke.
Right.
So we can bias that. And usually what you'll do is you'll just be working and you're like, oh man, I need this to draw either behind or in front. And so all the way down on the sprite renderer, there's this sort order hint. And you can literally think of these as force layers with 0 being in back. And so if I do 1, now our flash is drawing on top. Okay. That flash, it's one of those things that like, we want the gesture of it. I'm looking at it and I hate it because I see it there. What I want to do is see it in game and see how much it bothers me again in context. Yeah. I'm also going to save just on the odd chance that we crash.
Actually, it's not too bad in context, I don't think.
Yeah, I don't mind it. This the hint of that pop. We could actually make it a lot bigger, and I'll do that as we get to the polish part. Our effect is still looping because we're working on it, so just remember that like before we go to submit this and call it final, we would need to make sure we turn that off, or else some poor player is going to have explosions everywhere.
Yeah. It's an aftershock.
Yeah. So I feel like now, just because of the addition of the fire and the smoke and that flipbook, like we've got an effect. This is starting to be compelling. I'd say it's a little bit bare still though. So from here, in the next episode, we're gonna start adding cool stuff to it. This is where we kind of, as effects artists, you just get to explore and say like, what happens if we add rocks to it? That'll be fun. So let's try bringing in a mesh with some rocks in the next episode.
Yeah, and if you guys are enjoying this, if you're learning something, please subscribe to our YouTube channel. You can also follow us on social. Those links are in the description below. They're also on our website, beyondfx.com, and we're constantly posting new educational resources for VFX, short form content, medium form tutorials, longer courses like this. So stay tuned for that, and we'll see you guys in the next episode.